Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Wednesday edition of Point of View. What a night it has been and what a day it is. We have been sort of saying for actually weeks that January 5th and January 6th were going to be significant days, and they certainly were. First of all, let's spend just a minute talking about Georgia. We'll get into that in more detail next hour because we'll have our Georgia listeners joining us. But last night, many people predicted that Kelly Loeffler would win because of some of the polls, and actually I think we can say with certainty now that she has lost. Now, only 98% of the vote is in, but Raphael Warnock has 50.6%. She has 49.4%. By the way, the difference is 2,231,000 to 2,176,000. So, again, a very close election, but most likely Warnock will be the next senator from Georgia. It is also quite possible that Jon Ossoff will win, but that one has not been called yet. Again, I will remind you, only 98% of the precincts and the various counties have reported. Those that came in last were some of those that were considered to be blue counties. So in some respects, I think you could assume that Jon Ossoff will also be in the Senate representing Georgia, but right now 50.2% of the vote, 49.8% of the vote. Again, the difference between 2,213,000 to 2,195,000. So all the things that we predicted might happen have so far. And, of course, another prediction we can make is that now, as the rally is taking place and the president is making his claim that this was a stolen election and wanting individuals now to then march up to the Capitol, he has, of course, rallied the troops, but it will now be upon the joint session of Congress and the vice president, that would be his vice president, Mike Pence, to address the issues that we've been talking about for some time. One of the articles I posted, remember yesterday, if you happen to be listening at all with David French, we have such a polarized society that I'll be reading through an article and then I'll get some kind of throwaway line that's just attacking one person or the other, an ad hominem argument, and I'll go, okay, I'll throw that one away. And so it's been harder and harder to find some people who, on the one hand, let's in this case talk about Thomas Massey. Don't really know him, representative who is from Kentucky, a Republican, who's been an ally of Donald Trump, who nevertheless wants to lay down some hard truths. Well, when you lay down the hard truths, then of course you're expecting the next thing, a line that it then criticizes anybody that raises those questions. And what was missing from this, which I thought was very good, was a willingness to say, let me just give you some hard truths here, but I'm not going to criticize members of Congress or senators who disagree with me. Oh, well, that's refreshing. I'll take that anytime. So anyway, this is the first article we've posted there, and he gives us 3 hard truths. And it's things we've said before, but let's say them again, because here is a member of Congress who I suspect might even be one of those individuals that would vote to reconsider the Electoral College vote, but nevertheless says, okay, I need to calm down some of the people that are convinced that this is going to bring about a change for these 3 reasons. Reason number 1, if every Republican votes to disallow every Biden elector on January 6th, Biden will still be declared the winner by Congress. This is simple math. Democrats are in the majority and will vote to keep the Biden electors. So, point number 1. Point number 2, no state, and this is a point that I've made before, but it's probably worth making now because it comes from a member of Congress who knows this. No state has sent a competing set of electors. Each state has set only one slate of electors. No state legislature has asked Congress to reject its state electors. Now, some people say, well, this is kind of like that contested election back in the 19th century, and I did a commentary about that. Yes, at that time, though, the actual legislatures sent competing electors. In other words, you had a slate of Biden electors and a slate of Trump electors, and that happened back then. Of course, it was Benjamin Harrison. But nevertheless, and that doesn't exist. So the only thing you can do is, of course, what Senator Ted Cruz has argued, and that is to reject this vote and send him back to the legislatures to see if any of that would change. Now, the third point he makes, after talking about the fact that even if we have an up or down vote, Republicans don't have enough votes in the House, at least. Maybe they do in the Senate, but I'm not even sure you would get all of those Republican votes for Donald Trump. The third point he makes is that the new Attorney General, the man that has now replaced Bill Barr, took office on December 24th. And he says, as far as I can tell, has done nothing to investigate this election. He says, I don't know him. He might be a great person and well qualified, but Trump hired him and he doesn't seem to be investigating. So again, if you're going to be making the claims, and I suspect there will be some claims being made, what's the count up to? I think there's 70 Republicans in the House, more than a dozen in the Senate, who want to challenge and will, as now the clock is now ticking. But again, they will have to give evidence, and much of it are going to be allegations of various affidavits that have been provided. But none of that has been investigated in certainly an evidentiary way. Well, there have been a few of these cases that were slightly that, but nothing in a true evidentiary way where you have, in case one place, presented, made an article or presented by, I don't know, Rudy Giuliani or something like that, and then a counter arguments being made, and then a chance to respond to the counter arguments. Nothing like that is happening, nor will it happen again today. And if nothing else, in this particular article we've posted by Becca Lowry, she points out that after making these 3 points in Twitter, which are posted, and you can read those again if you'd like to get some more information. She goes on to say one thing that's important to note in Massey's statement: there's no admonishment for GOP or Republican senators and congressmen leading the fight against potential election fraud, just facts. And she says that's in stark contrast to other Republicans, like Senator Tom Cotton, Senator Mitt Romney, taking to, of all places, CNN to rip up their own party's members as a danger to democracy. And in the same vein as Massey, another ally of President Donald Trump, that would be Senator Tim Scott, had this to say, and then she reads from where Tim Scott said, as I read the Constitution, there is no constitutionally viable means for the Congress to overturn an election wherein the states have certified and sent their electors. And so, again, you have individuals who you would say have been supporters of Donald Trump. Thomas Massey, a representative from Kentucky, a Republican. Tim Scott, a Republican from South Carolina, all saying, you know, these are just some hard truths we need to put on the table. And so, if nothing else, it does seem to me that that is going to be an exercise that will not change the fact that on the 20th of January, you're going to have Joe Biden actually taking the oath of office. If you disagree or you think one of those arguments is flawed, give us a call, 800-351-1212. But I want to come back and talk about the fact that the way to begin to address the challenges and the allegations of election fraud are not to ignore them and not to ridicule them. And that gets us into the second article we've posted, and I'll talk about that right after these messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Today, both houses of Congress will meet to formally count the votes of the Electoral College. In previous years, this has been a mere formality. But 2020 and 2021 are not typical years. Presiding over this joint session is the Vice President, who will have to rule on challenges from Republican members of Congress. The debate about the slate of electors from each state is likely to rekindle the debate about the Electoral College. In previous commentaries, I've talked about the many criticisms leveled against this constitutional institution. Some have argued that it is racist and actually provides an advantage to white people. But that is not how many black leaders perceive it. They believe the Electoral College gives African Americans a significant vote. Civil rights leader Vernon Jordan, for example, argued that if you take away the Electoral College, then the importance of that black vote melts away. Blacks, instead of being crucial to victory in major states, simply become 10% of the total electorate with reduced impact. Not only does the Electoral College protect the vote of minorities, it also protects the vote of smaller states. That is why the framers created it in the first place. They were fearful that big states and big cities would always determine the outcome. Tara Ross, in her book, The Indispensable Electoral College, How the Founders' Plan Saves Our Country from Mob Rule, provides many examples from history. The founders provided a system that today provides representation for groups as diverse as farmers, minorities, and small states. Many states have signed on to the National Popular Vote Compact that would eventually dismantle the Electoral College, but the initiative seems stalled for now. I doubt today's debate will encourage any other states to sign on to the compact. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, we certainly talked about the first article, and that is some of the hard truths laid down by an individual that's been a Trump supporter in Congress, and also a quoted real quickly from a Trump supporter that actually spoke for the president at the Republican convention, Tim Scott, and you can use a variety of other individuals. But let's now come to the other side of that, because some people say this whole exercise is worthless and there's no value in it. And again, maybe it's not going to do anything other than highlight the fact that there are a lot of people that don't feel comfortable about this particular election. So what do? It seems to me that you spend the time saying, okay, here are some of the allegations. Here seems to be answers for it, or here's some allegations. Some of those are true, and we violated the law. Maybe somebody needs to be fined. Maybe we need to have the Congress investigate this. Maybe the Attorney General needs to investigate this. Maybe the state legislatures need to firm up their laws to prevent some kind of judge for changing the rules along the way. I think those are reasonable things to be actually put on the table. But my second article comes from Stella Morabito. Again, I'm finding all sorts of people in this conversation that we've never had on the program. I'd like to know more about Stella, but I'll see what I can find out. But nevertheless, she wrote a piece which I thought was very well argued as well. The title of it, which you can find on our website, Ignoring and Ridiculing Election Fraud Concerns Will Not Make Them Go Away. You think? When you have the kind of rally that's been taking place now over the last couple of hours in Washington, D.C., and that's just a fraction of the people that would agree with some of the things being said at the rally outside of Congress, you would think that the desire on the part, first, of some people in the media who all of a sudden have become very uncurious about any possibility of voter fraud. This time 4 years ago, were convinced that there was Russian hacking. Now there's just not a talk about maybe there are some problems that need to be addressed. And then, of course, the uncuriousness of the whole Democratic Party, I think illustrates the point. And so she's making the case that restoration of trust and due process is, of course, the goal of what Senator Ted Cruz will try to lead in the Senate. He said he and 11 other senators signed this particular statement, and we have a link so you can read the statement for yourself. I won't go into the statement. But whether or not you agree, she says, that there was massive electoral fraud in the 2020 election, or maybe a better phrase, widespread electoral fraud, because we've heard the previous attorney general say there's not widespread electoral fraud, which is a way of saying, yeah, there's been some fraud, but it's not enough to change the election. But she says whether you believe that or not, it really doesn't matter. Every American should be deeply concerned if nearly half of all voters are convinced that there has been fraud, which actually handed the election to Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. That's the case. And that number and that percentage is not going to diminish, I think she would make the case, over the next couple of months. The ratification and the certification that will take place today, no doubt, eventually, in Congress over the Electoral College is not going to have everybody go, okay, I'm done. Because she points out that if you just take the Rasmussen poll, and I'll use this one later on when we get talking with Justin Giboney. By the way, he's going to be with us today talking about the book that he and a number of others have written about compassion and conviction. The Rasmussen polls indicate that 47% of voters believe that fraud swayed the election. That would be about 75% of Republicans. Now, again, some dismiss Rasmussen, she says, as leaning to the right. And, of course, Mr. Rasmussen's been on this program. It's been quite some time. But nevertheless, even if you dismiss his poll, you can look at some that are considered more left-leaning pollsters, and that would be Quinnipiac and Reuters. And they still claim, maybe not that 75% of Republicans believe that there was fraud, but at least 50% do. So we can have a debate intramurally about which poll is accurate and how many Republicans really believe that there was fraud. Maybe you believe some of that drops over time. I don't believe much of it does. And interestingly enough, the Reuters poll, if we now want to get into polls for a minute, actually noted that 16% of Democrats and 33% of independents also believe that there was fraud. So this is not good news for the incoming Congress. It's not good for the incoming so-called president-elect. He's been called the president-elect before he really was president-elect, but okay. And some expect these millions to come around, probably, but will all of those? Probably not. So she says, any way you slice it, the numbers are disturbing. We all feel in our gut that November's election was at least the weirdest election we've had in our history. And you don't have to be, she says, a Trump voter to be disturbed by some of the peculiarities and wanting to maybe have an audit of the voting machines or actually going back and wanting to check the signatures and all sorts of other things. But she says, while the legal team for the Trump campaign may not have had the time to investigate, bring, or win many non-procedural arguments, these concerns still matter to the public and deserve investigation. And then she goes through a couple of places you can check. One is that 36-page report by Peter Navarro, who is the Director of Office and Trade and Manufacturing. You have Willis Krumholtz one, which was in the Federalist, and a couple of others, and I think I've posted one somewhere here. As a matter of fact, I can pull it up if we need to. So you can find some of those lists, and some of them are longer than others. Some of those on the list, to be fair, have been set aside. And that's another point that should be made for some of the people that are really convinced that all of this stealing has taken place. You might at least want to use best arguments. Even the other day, I heard Sean Hannity, who's certainly been convinced that there was fraud, pointing out that early on there were some statements being made that obviously proved not to be true. And I think you could honestly see that there were all sorts of things circulating on the internet. A lot of them turned out not to be true, but some of them I think still have some validity and need to be judged. So, if nothing else, she goes on to point out that the fact that even the New York Post, which is supposedly somewhat conservative, was telling President Trump to give up, but they also would not squarely address the issue of whether or not to audit some of the votes and voting machines and the whole issue of transparency. And she says, of course, we also know that big tech and media have been investigated into trying to simply dismiss any arguments of fraud. And she doesn't say this, but the overuse of the phrase, they allege without evidence. Well, okay, if you say there's no evidence, you mean no evidence that has been actually put in a court of law. Well, that's true. But if evidence are sworn affidavits, that would be considered evidence. And again, the media has been willing to play along with some of this as well. So she goes into the fact that finally, the editor of the Federalist, she's writing for the Federalist, Molly Hemingway, has been on the program with us before, pointed out that there's a big disconnect between most of the conservative blue check Twitter and the bulk of American, especially on the right, regarding the existence of election fraud. So the point is that if nothing else, she points out that we've got to consider some possibilities. One is to just simply try to argue that the election was fair and any question about fraud should go unaddressed. Don't think that's going to be working. It's not working yet. Number two, the idea that maybe they feel that there were abnormalities, but since we don't see clear proof, we'll just simply let the election go unchallenged. And that's not happening. Possibility three, that maybe there's actually something to hide, and so as a result, the investigation might show something that really needs to be investigated. And so she takes you through some of these possibilities and just reminds us that if indeed we want to have a country that comes together, and I don't see any evidence of it right now at all. Part of that is illustrated only so well by the fact that we pointed out yesterday when we did the interview with David French that we have now 3 times as many people living in so-called landslide counties. Those are counties where the president, any presidential candidate, wins by at least 20 points. Back in 1980, there were about 400 of those. Now there's about 1,700 of those and counting, almost 35%. There are, in a sense, more extreme views, both on the right and the left, both in red and blue, than ever before. And in the midst of this polarization, you're kidding yourself if you think that people are going to just go, okay, all right, I guess we'll just have to accept the results in this highly partisan and polarized country. The better way to do it is to address the issue. I'm not sure what's going to happen over the next couple of hours is the best way to do it, but at least it raises the issue that needs to be discussed. And unfortunately, as she points out in this very good piece, ignoring it or ridiculing it is not going to bring about any kind of unity. We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Going to be talking about some of this in the National Hour, and then I might, just as a program note, that mentioned about an hour from now, we'll have Lucas Miles with us. Just thought we'd break it up a little bit, and we'll be talking about this new film, The Penitent Thief, and I think you would appreciate that. It's got kind of a star-studded cast, and it's just a great way to recognize that things actually take place apart from politics. Then we'll get back to some of the political issues, because I mentioned Justin Giboney will be with us. At 2 o'clock, we'll talk about compassion and conviction. Then we'll come back with some other issues. And maybe by 2:30, we'll kind of see what has been unfolding in the House chamber. And while I talk about that for just a minute, I mentioned this the other day, but it's even more disturbing. The games that get played by people in positions of leadership. And it, I think, illustrates why we should recognize that when the Democrats finally said maybe it's time to implement term limits on the leadership, Nancy Pelosi was willing to go along with it because this is maybe the last time she's planning on being Speaker of the House. But interestingly enough, Newt Gingrich took over as Speaker of the House. You had the special elections, midterm elections in 1994, and he ran on this idea of the contract with America. So when he took over in 1995, he found all sorts of things that had been happening in the House of Representatives in terms of the bank and in terms of games that were played and favors that were provided and all the rest, because essentially the House of Representatives had been controlled for such a long time by the Democrats that they tried to essentially clean house because of some things that happened. You know, Nancy Pelosi has been the Speaker of the House. Then there was a time in which John Boehner and even, of course, Paul Ryan were Speaker of the House, and now she's back to being Speaker of the House. And just to illustrate this, I mentioned this the other day, that in order for her to even be elected Speaker of the House, she had to try to bring in some individuals who either were testing positive for COVID-19 or had been exposed to people that are COVID-19. As a matter of fact, this Friday, we are going to have one less individual around the table simply because that individual was exposed to somebody that had COVID-19. That's the kind of care that we try to have. And in my Sunday school class, I was just hearing about some people that have been exposed, encouraged them to stay home, not just for the days in which they were actually testing positive for a lengthy period of time. Let's keep everybody safe. Guess what? That's not what Nancy Pelosi did. And if you haven't seen this by now, I also mentioned the fact that she actually was having it so close that she could only lose about 6 Democratic votes to retain her post. She lost 5. But the way she didn't lose additional ones is that during the dead of night, Nancy Pelosi had House officials build a special plexiglass box in the chamber so that members who had been exposed to COVID-19, or in one case, somebody who had actually tested positive, could actually sit there and cast their votes. If you watch C-SPAN today, when you look at the House chambers, I'm pretty sure that plexiglass box is still up there, and it's just a testimony to the fact that the kind of games that get played. And one Republican, that would be Representative Rodney Davis, who's a Republican from Illinois, said to build a structure like that in the dark of night to only protect the votes that Speaker Pelosi needs to get reelected as Speaker is shameful. He said there was a complete lack of communication with the minority party, that would be the Republicans, and this, as he said, made the move 100% political. He went on to say this is completely against everything we are told throughout this entire pandemic for House operations. And so as a result, you can see that when these different lawmakers voted, including, of course, Gwen Moore, a Democrat from Wisconsin who tested positive for the coronavirus, that was enough for her to be elected. And, of course, what happened is he needed every vote because there were 5 Democrats who either voted for someone else or simply voted present. And so that's what actually took place in terms of this Democratic vote. And it just illustrates again how so much of what is happening in Congress has become politicized. Anyway, let me get to my third article here. And this one is by William Galston. I've quoted him quite often. He is another one of these individuals who's a Democrat, but you can have a good conversation with him. He actually, for a while, worked with the Clinton administration, but many times has really begun to understand some of the challenges that we're facing and is a fair individual to look at these issues. And he calls it the blessings and curses of federalism. You might remember what federalism is. Maybe in a civics class you learned that Congress has been given certain enumerated powers, and that these powers given to the federal government are few and specified, but the rest of those powers are reserved to the states and the people. And you have that described in the Federalist Papers. You also have it described essentially in the 10th Amendment to the Constitution, along with, of course, what's even in the Constitution itself. And so, in a sense, what we say is that a lot of things aren't the responsibility of the federal government. They're really the responsibility of the states. And when you come to voting and you come to distributing the COVID-19 vaccine, you can see both the blessings of federalism and the curses of federalism. Because William Galston says, the 15th Amendment gives the federal government the right to enforce the equal right of every citizen, regardless of race and color. So in some respects, there's a little bit of a role for the federal government, make sure that there's not discrimination in the vote. But otherwise, Article 1, Section 4, and even Article 2, Section 1, both gave the states the right to developing the rules for electing the president, as well as members of the House and Senate. So when we talk about a national election, we mean that really what it is 50 different state elections and the District of Columbia that determine the national office. But these are all essentially done in the states. And he uses that to point out that that's why Senator Tom Cotton decided that he would not join some of the other Republicans like Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley and others, because he said, look, the founders entrusted our elections to the states, not the Congress, which I think is true. And so even so, we have this Electoral Count Act of 1877, because we had the most contested election with Benjamin Harrison, which has now given Congress a mechanism for challenging the states of electors. But at the same time, as he points out, no state has sent dueling states of electors to Congress. And as we pointed out just a minute ago, that kind of ends the discussion, I think. But nevertheless, he points out that that is a very key issue. But now he goes on to take on the other topic, and that is, in addition to letting the states actually control the election. And so if you've got a problem with what Georgia did, go to Georgia. Don't go to President Trump. Don't go to the Attorney General unless there's some kind of malfeasance or something like that. But now let's move from the voting to the vaccine. Because he says, on the other hand, the struggle with COVID-19 should lead devotees to devolution to reflect on the failures of the past 10 months. Because there has been a real pressure really since the recession of 2008 and 2009 to cut funding for public health services. So in many cases, the states were, as he points out, unprepared for this pandemic. They lacked some of the personnel. They didn't have all the resources to conduct the tests and contact tracing. And if you want to blame that on Donald Trump, fine, but almost all of that happened in a previous administration, which would be what? Oh, that would be the Obama administration. You'll hear it here. You'll not hear it in mainstream press. And so he points out that in October, states in the District of Columbia were required to submit preliminary vaccine distribution and administration plans to the Center for Disease Control, and very few actually did so. So if you want to blame the president for the lack of vaccine distribution and the way in which it's been done poorly, knock yourself out. But the reality is you need to go back to the states. And I thought it's kind of interesting because we did see a CNN reporter the other day really come after the governor of Florida And maybe while that is appropriate because the governor may have more authority than the president, it was, again, I think, a little bit unfair, unless that same or other CNN reporter would come after the governor, I don't know, California, New York, somewhere else. And so that is the case. So as a result, what we have is, in this particular case, though we'd like to have kind of a national program for vaccine distribution, it brings us back to, once again, federalism. And each particular state has its responsibility. And William Galston, again, high marks for being willing to acknowledge that this isn't really a Trump problem. It's a state problem. And it isn't necessarily even the problem of the governors. It's a problem of the fact that we cut back some of the funding for public health, and the pandemic caught us off guard. I think that's a fair evaluation of federalism. We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and then we will, of course, have our national hour at 1 o'clock, and we'll be paying attention to what is happening there in the certification of the Electoral College. Let me just, before we get to that, mention the fact that there are people on both sides, and it seems to me that one of the things that we should be learning, especially from the conversation we had yesterday with David French, is just because somebody disagrees with you might mean that you believe they're wrong. wrong, but it doesn't mean that they're evil. And I was trying to emphasize that just a few minutes ago when we actually quoted from a few individuals who, on the one hand, were willing to acknowledge a problem, but at the same time not attribute to other people wrong motives or claim that they should be primaried in the next election or whatever. And we've seen just a tremendous amount of division. And a good way to illustrate this as we kind of come to the end of this hour is to say that I've got in front of me here two very well-written articles by two different members of Congress, both of whom have been on the program at one point or another, both Republicans, both really in some respects trying to be fair about some of the issues in terms of what is unfolding right now. And I think that should be a very good model, if you will, for why we should think about how this is going to play itself out in the next few days, weeks, and months. And first of all, the first piece I want to read from comes from Mike Gallagher. He might sound to you like a name that's a talk show host. As a matter of fact, it is a similar name, but he's also a Republican out of Wisconsin, represents Wisconsin's 8th District. His piece is Why Republicans in Congress Shouldn't Object to Electoral College Certification. And he says, many of my congressional colleagues are prepared to take this step. I am not. And he says, I certainly know that there are people that I love, trust, and represent in Wisconsin that believe the presidential election was stolen. This is a serious claim that deserves serious consideration. He also talks about the fact that I endorsed and campaigned hard for President Trump. I've also spent the last 2 months investigating claims of election fraud, and I found real deficiencies in our voting processes that must be fixed. Okay, I agree with that. There's some irregularities, to put it mildly, there. Nevertheless, he says Joe Biden won Wisconsin by more than 20,000 votes, a margin that has survived multiple court challenges. Contesting the certified electors also raises a larger question. Can Congress retroactively overrule the states when it comes to certifying their elections? The answer is no. The framers did not trust the federal government with that power. He says, now, I recognize that objectors disagree. They point to the Electors Clause in Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution. But nevertheless, the point he makes is that people with pretty good academic credentials, legal credentials, don't necessarily see it that way. And more importantly, I guess he doesn't raise it until later, but I'll raise it now. If indeed you see that this is appropriate for Republicans to do that when they have a concern about an election, don't you see that it would be possible for Democrats to do that when they have a question about an election? Now, the answer sometimes is, yeah, they were doing it for 4 years against Donald Trump. I don't disagree with that. But nevertheless, here you have Representative Mike Gallagher, an individual who obviously is certainly a supporter of Donald Trump and a Republican. But let me give you the other side, and that is Representative Jim Jordan. He's a Republican. He's out of Ohio. He's been on the program as well. And he actually made the argument on the floor of the House on Tuesday that the United States Constitution was violated and that so many people don't care. Let me give you his quote. Representative Jim Jordan said, Democrats don't care. They don't want to look into it. They'd rather just belittle 60 million of our fellow citizens, call them names, say it is a conspiracy, make fun of the very people they're all supposed to represent. And that brings me back to the point that I made earlier. If you are just joining us, one of the first articles I posted is entitled Ridiculing Election Fraud. And that particular piece illustrates again that you aren't going to move ahead in America by ignoring some of the concerns that people have about possible fraud or voting irregularities. And you're certainly not going to move ahead by ridiculing those individuals. And so again, just to give his comment a little more force, Representative Jim Jordan said during the campaign, Vice President Biden would get 55 people at an event. Donald Trump got 55,000 at just one event. President Trump increased his vote with African Americans, increased his vote with Hispanic Americans, won 19 of 20 bellwether counties, won Ohio by 8, Iowa by 8, Florida by 3, got 11 million more votes than he got in 2016, and House Republicans won 27 of 27 toss-up races. But somehow, Joe Biden, the guy who barely left his house, won the election. And so, again, Jim Jordan says, well, maybe, but 80 million Americans, he says 80 million Americans, both Republicans and Democrats, have their doubts, and 60 million Americans think the election was stolen. 60 million people, over one-third of the electorate, but no one in this town seems to care. Democrats don't care. Media doesn't care. 80 million of our fellow citizens have their doubts about the election 2 months ago, and the media and the Democrats say nothing to see here. Of course, this town has been out to get the president since July 31st, 2016, when he was elected the first time. Before he was elected the first time, I should say. 4 years and $40 million on the Russian hoax, and we can't look into an election. And so he said he and the Republicans have tried to uncover the truth, but he says not one investigation, not one hearing in the House of Representatives. We've asked for it. We asked Chairwoman Maloney, Mr. Coleman. I asked for it. We asked Chairman Nadler. Nope, not going to do it. We welcomed an Inspector General investigation, for goodness sake. Over 200 affidavits, declarations of wrongdoing, but no investigation in Congress, no subpoenas, no depositions, no chance for question or cross-examination of witnesses. Why won't we look into it? Why no hearings? Why no investigation? I think it's because deep down, he says, deep down they know there were big problems with this past election. They know the Constitution was violated. Article 1, Section 4, time and place of manner of holding elections shall be determined by each state by the legislature thereof. Article 2, Section 1, each state shall appoint in such manner as the legislature may direct. And if nothing else, then goes through some of the violations. Pennsylvania, for example, that mail-in ballots are supposed to be by 8 o'clock on Election Day, and election ends on 8 o'clock, and mail-in ballots have to be there by 8 o'clock. But the Supreme Court says, nope, we're going to extend the election day till Friday, to 5 o'clock Friday, and points out some of the other misdeeds that are there as well. So if nothing else, you can see that there is a place for individuals that have been Trump supporters, individuals that are Republicans, to disagree about the situation. And if nothing else, it illustrates back to the point, you don't move forward by ignoring some of these concerns, and you certainly don't move forward by ridiculing the people that bring them up. Yet we're going to hear that. Of course, they've already accused Ted Cruz of sedition of a sitting United States senator for wanting to challenge the Electoral College results because of some election irregularities. That's the world we find ourselves in, and it relates very much to the conversation we had yesterday with David French in his book, Divided We Fall. Let's take a break, though. When we come back, we will have our National Hour. I suspect some of our listeners from Georgia want to tell some stories. And, of course, before it's all through, we'll talk about a film at about 1:30, and then at 2 o'clock, talk a little bit about Christians getting involved in politics and try to give you an update on everything happening in Congress. It's going to be an interesting day, and I hope you'll stay with us throughout the 3 hours today that we broadcast, and even more importantly, we'll have a better understanding of what happened tomorrow right here on Point of View. Let's take a break. We'll be back with more right after this.
Sometimes I think about seeds. You ever stop to consider that some seeds become entire trees and some trees grow up and produce fruit? Other seeds become flowers or vines that bring us vegetables or berries. And some trees don't have fruit, but they're just pretty, especially in some parts of the country when it comes to the fall colors. Yeah, sometimes my mind goes off like that. And I also think about such things when it comes to the seeds that so many have planted in the quest to impact our nation through Point of View Radio. You may think that your gift is a small thing, but like a seed, it can grow to have an impact beyond your imagination. If you want to see beauty again in America, consider planting a seed today and making a difference by joining the Point of View Truth Team. Get the details today, right now, by visiting pointofview.net/team or call us at 1-800-347-5151. Plant a seed for a great future. Cultivate truth. pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Wednesday edition of Point of View, and this is the day we've been talking about for some time. First of all, it takes place after last night, and if you have not been paying attention, does indeed believe and look like a day that Democrats will actually have won both of the U.S. Senate races, but one's too close to call still. But if you now see those particular races being called, about 98% of those precincts have reported, and Raphael Warnock has 50.6% of the vote. Kelly Loeffler has about 49.4%. Again, a very small difference there between 2,231,000, 2,176,000. Even closer when we talk about John Ossoff and David Perdue, because again, about 50.2% to 49.8%. Again, with 98% of the precincts reporting. A few more have repeated over the last few hours, but they have not called that. But the trend looks in that direction. So I'd love to hear from some of you in Georgia, your thoughts about these two U.S. Senate races. And, of course, the long-term implication of it is something we have talked about before. But we can't focus too much time and attention on that, because you may be aware of what's been taking place here in Washington, D.C., a rally outside of the Capitol. The president spoke, and a variety of others did as well, marching up to the Capitol. And then, of course, now ongoing debate in the Congress, a joint session of Congress, which is being presided over by the Vice President Mike Pence, and the decision to object from, and I think we're now coming up with almost 70 different members of the House of Representatives and about a dozen members in the Senate, and the ongoing debate that will take place. So there are some really important issues to put on the table. And over the next 2 hours, we're going to do our best to cover some of that. But just to break it up, since we don't know everything that's going to be taking place, I also wanted to, at the bottom of the hour, tell you about a new film coming out called The Penitent Thief. Just another great way to use this to expose people to the gospel and to the story of Jesus Christ. And, of course, it involves a number of individuals that have various kinds of credentials as actors and actresses. So we'll talk about that. Next hour, we'll be getting into a book called Compassion and the whole issue of conviction, and just talking about where do we go from here in terms of the fact that there are so many individuals that have voted and said, I don't know if I trust my vote. I don't know in this polarized situation if anybody is even paying attention to some of the concerns we're raising. And even yesterday, you had a speech given by Representative Jim Jordan, a Republican out of Ohio, in which his argument was that Democrats don't care. His argument was the Constitution has been violated. There are some real concerns about voter fraud. We've asked on numerous occasions if various chairwomen and chairmen would actually hold hearings. Nobody would want to hold hearings. Nobody wants to investigate anything. And so we'll talk about that in just a few minutes. But one of the things I wanted to put on the table is an article that is written by Representative Thomas Massie, who has been identified as an ally of Donald Trump, who actually is an individual that probably has some concerns, but at the same time put out a series of tweets, and these are summarized by Becca Lauer in Red State, and I just thought they would be helpful, because if anybody is sitting here right now thinking that things are going to change because of this objection and because of the vote, He's just at least trying to calm everybody down a little bit and recognize what will or will not happen today in terms of the challenge of the Electoral College vote. Here's these 3 points real quickly, and you can read them and find some other information, not only about some things that he's posted, but it also goes into some things posted by Senator Tim Scott and a number of others. But point number 1, he calls this a hard truth. He says if every Republican votes to disallow every Biden elector on January 6th, Biden will still be declared the winner by Congress. He said this is just simple math. Democrats are in the majority and will vote to keep the Biden electors. Number 1. Number 2, this is a point that I think you need to pay attention to because a number of people today have been writing about this. No state has sent a competing set of electors. Each state has set only one slate of electors. No state legislature has asked Congress to reject its state electors. You might remember a couple of weeks ago when I talked about the most contentious election, Benjamin Harrison. At the time, at least the states had sent competing slates of electors, both Republican and Democrat. But right now, you have just electors that have been sent to Congress. Let's take those states that voted for Joe Biden. Only Biden electors. There are no Trump electors that have been sent. And that's an important point because later on, as this debate takes place in the Senate, Senator Ted Cruz is going to argue really not that we accept a different set of electors because they don't exist, but that these electors and this be sent back to the state legislatures for reconsideration. And then the third point by Thomas Massey, I think also is relevant, and that is he said the new Attorney General for Donald Trump, in other words, the replacement for Bill Barr, who took office December 24th, says that as far as I can tell, has done nothing to investigate this election. I don't know him. He might be a great person, well qualified, but Trump hired him, and he doesn't seem to be investigating, which is kind of the theme you're going to start hearing today, and that is we don't have any investigation. And it brings me to my second article. This is by Stella Morabito, who actually I found out after the fact has been on the program, I think about 3 years ago, but maybe we need to get her back on. But this is the second article, which I'll go into in a little more detail after the break. But her article simply makes this statement. Ignoring and ridiculing election fraud concerns will not make them go away. She points out that if you look at some of the polls, let's take the Rasmussen poll for just a minute, 47% of voters believe that fraud swayed the election. That would be, by the way, about 75% of Republicans believe that. She says, okay, you might dismiss the Rasmussen poll because, after all, he's been on the program with us. He's maybe leaning to the right. Let's take some polls that lean to the left, like the Quinnipiac poll or the Reuters poll. Even the Reuters poll found that about 16% of Democrats and 33% of independents agreed that there was fraud in this election. The Quinnipiac one has a sizable percentage of all registered voters, of which there are 34% not believing that the Biden-Harris ticket won legitimately. And you even have, I think, one of these polls that I was looking at a while back, maybe disagreeing that 75% of Republicans disagreed, but at least 50% even in some of the other polls. And so the question I want to put on the table, which we'll get to after the break, whether you agree that fraud has taken place or not, which is kind of her argument, whether you believe that there was widespread fraud or not, you really can't move the country ahead with simply the idea that we'll just continue to ignore that, which has been kind of the philosophy of the mainstream media, most of the Democratic leadership, especially in the House of Representatives, or that you can just ridicule individuals who believe it. After all, we've got a sizable number of people, millions and millions of people, and I'll use some of those numbers from certainly Jim Jordan just a minute ago to say, how do you move a country forward when so many people have very significant questions? We'll talk about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Today, both houses of Congress will meet to formally count the votes of the Electoral College. In previous years, this has been a mere formality. But 2020 and 2021 are not typical years. Presiding over this joint session is the Vice President, who will have to rule on challenges from Republican members of Congress. The debate about the slate of electors from each state is likely to rekindle the debate about the Electoral College. In previous commentaries, I've talked about the many criticisms leveled against this constitutional institution. Some have argued that it is racist and actually provides an advantage to white people. But that is not how many black leaders perceive it. They believe the Electoral College gives African Americans a significant vote. Civil rights leader Vernon Jordan, for example, argued that if you take away the Electoral College, then the importance of that black vote melts away. Blacks, instead of being crucial to victory in major states, simply become 10% of the total electorate with reduced impact. Not only does the Electoral College protect the vote of minorities, it also protects the vote of smaller states. That is why the framers created it in the first place. They were fearful that big states and big cities would always determine the outcome. Tara Ross, in her book, The Indispensable Electoral College, How the Founders' Plan Saves Our Country from Mob Rule, provides many examples from history. The founders provided a system that today provides representation for groups as diverse as farmers, minorities, and small states. Many states have signed on to the National Popular Vote Compact that would eventually dismantle the Electoral College, but the initiative seems stalled for now. I doubt today's debate will encourage any other states to sign on to the compact. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Once again, if you'd like to join the conversation, let's open up the phones, 1-800-351-1212. Maybe those of you in Georgia have some comments about the election last night. We've been watching it, but also I suspect some of you have some comments. You may have been watching the speeches that were given by President Donald Trump and a number of others at the rally outside of the Capitol, and also have maybe been even watching some of that. Matter of fact, I suspect some people may be watching C-SPAN and not listening to this program. I understand that. But for those of you that were around and would like to join the conversation, again, 1-800-351-1212. Bottom of the hour, we'll maybe change topics a little bit so we can kind of watch what's going on in the chambers of the House and Senate as this unfolds. But nevertheless, wanted to give you that opportunity. But let me come back to my second article, because it does remind us that if you really want to move forward, you've got a very significant bump in the road, even if you're convinced that there's no problem, because the Rasmussen poll shows that 47% of voters actually believe there was fraud that swayed the election. You might say, well, I don't believe Rasmussen. Okay, Quinnipiac has 34% of registered voters. So whether you talk about nearly half or one-third, you've got to govern the entire country. And when that is out there, we've already been through 4 years where people have been alleging that the Russians had an influence on the election of Donald Trump. Now recognize that maybe a smaller percentage of those were believing in Russian interference. What do you do when there's such a large percentage of individuals that have questions about that? And as I pointed out, Are Republicans just simply going to, come around? They're just going to go along. 75% of Republicans for the Rasmussen poll, 50% in the Quinnipiac and Reuters poll. These are huge numbers and really unprecedented. So she goes on to say that while Trump's legal team may not have had the time to investigate, bring, and win many of the non-procedure arguments, these concerns still matter to the public and deserve investigation. And when you have some of these anomalies, which have been documented, she quotes a couple of them. The 36-page report by Peter Navarro, Director of Office of Trade and Manufacturing Policy, Willis Crumold Swan in The Federalist, and a number of others. Yes, there have indeed been some individuals that have made extravagant claims that turned out to be false, especially when the internet was going wild days after the election. There were all sorts of things being said that turned out not to be true. But again, she points out that the big media and big tech have been really invested in doing all it can to not even talk about it, or when it does come up, make the case that election fraud is extremely rare, or it's not widespread, which, by the way, was the comment from the previous Attorney General Bill Barr. But certainly I have said from the very beginning, even if you can identify some voter fraud and some electoral irregularities, it's worth investigating. Which brings me to the speech that was given yesterday by Representative Jim Jordan, a Republican out of Ohio, in which, as I pointed out, he said, people don't seem to even care. Let me give him his due, because then I want to talk about a fellow Republican in Congress who disagrees with him. So I'll give you both sides. He said during the campaign, Vice President Biden would get 55 people at an event. President Trump would get 55,000 people at just one rally. President Trump increased his vote with African Americans, increased his vote with Hispanic Americans, won 19 of 20 bellwether counties, won Ohio by 8, Iowa by 8, Florida by 3, got 11 million more votes than he got in 2016, and House Republicans won 27 of 27 toss-up races. But somehow, Joe Biden, the guy who barely left his house, won the election. So he goes on to say, well, maybe, but 80 million Americans, that's 80 million Americans, both Republicans and Democrats, have their doubts, and 60 million Americans think the election was stolen. Goes back to those polls I mentioned just a minute ago. 60 million, or over one-third of the electorate, but no one, he says, in this town seems to care. Democrats don't care. Media doesn't care. 80 million of our fellow citizens have their doubts about the election 2 months ago, and the media and Democrats say nothing to see here. And then he goes on to talk about how 4 years of and $40 million for the Russian hoax. But then he goes on to explain that we could just at least have an investigation, couldn't we? And he says no one hearing in the House of Representatives has taken place so far. We asked Chairwoman Maloney, Mr. Coleman, I asked for it. We asked Chairman Nadler, nope, not going to do it. We welcomed an Inspector General investigation, for goodness sake. Over 200 affidavits and declarations of wrongdoing, but no investigation in the Congress, no subpoenas, no depositions, no chance for question, no cross-examination of witnesses. Why won't they look into it? Why no hearings? And he goes on then gives some examples out of Pennsylvania, which we've talked about before. And so this is the argument being made at that point by Representative Jim Jordan, a Republican from Ohio. But to be fair, let's again mention someone else, and that would be a representative from Wisconsin, also Republican, Mike Gallagher, who wrote a piece called Why Republicans in Congress Shouldn't Object to the Electoral College Certification. And his argument is, I think you probably heard this before, that this is the responsibility of the states, and that even as he's looked into some of these deficiencies in Wisconsin, he says that Joe Biden won Wisconsin by more than 20,000 votes. He acknowledges that there are some problems with the voter process in Wisconsin that must be fixed, but he believes that that margin of 20,000 has survived various court challenges and certainly is not at the level of some of the problems that he's identified. And so he's argued that since this is a responsibility of the states, he actually disagrees with the idea that Republicans should challenge the Electoral College certification. So let's take some phone calls. And if nothing else, we'll spend some time, if we can, taking some of your phone calls. So let's head first to South Carolina and talk to Michael. I guess we don't have Michael on yet. So we'll go to Nancy first in South Carolina. Nancy, what would you add to our conversation?
I just wanted to say, if the election between President Trump and Mr. Biden, if the election was using the Dominion voting machines, which are so in question on so many different levels, I mean, if you watch the Georgia hearing, it was unbelievable, the 5-hour plus hearing about the machines and all, then why yesterday were they allowed to use these same machines in Georgia?
Yes.
I'm just curious.
I don't know why they were either, because, I'm broadcasting today from the state of Texas. And the state of Texas on 3 separate occasions looked at Dominion voting machines and said, nope, we're not going to use them. And yesterday they did have a problem with one of the voting machines in Georgia. And I thought, just at a time when you're trying to get a brand that has already been sort of attacked, the last thing you needed was a problem. Now they're saying it was a small one, but nevertheless, you've asked a very good question, and it's a question that maybe some people in Georgia can explain for us, because here we go again with some machines that people have had some questions about. Let me go back to South Carolina. I think Michael had a comment, and I'd love to hear your comments as well.
I just calling. I was listening to your subject a while ago, but I think that we all just need to take a step back and just calm down. I'm a godly person. I think that God put good things and bad things before us. For a trial. Just to see how well we'll do it, just to see how we'll handle it. President Trump. He's a wise person. He's a good person, but he's also a man. So for the mistakes that were made, none of us can correct that. But God sees all things. He corrects all things. So I'm thinking is that a lot of the pain and a lot of the frustration to go away. If the media, kind of let it die down some. I'm saying, I know these subjects are pertinent and we need to discuss them. In order to get past them. Since the election, November 13th, November 3rd, this thing is just, it just aggravates me that we're still getting ready to go through a different transition. But we're still talking about, the issue with the machines, with the voting fraud.
Yep. And again, I think what we need to do, and I think, like you said, is that first of all, it'd be helpful if the media would calm down a little bit, but allow for a conversation. I think the point, if I understood you making, is we really need an opportunity to have the arguments being presented and then counter arguments given, because some of the arguments I see people making are not valid in light of checking them out, but others seem valid. And this is what we, first of all, need to do to have people have confidence in the election. But even more important, we've got another congressional election taking place in 2 years. We also have a couple of various special elections are going to be given very quickly, because some of these members of the House are going to be in the Biden administration. So let's solve some of those problems. We'll be right back.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Well, Congress is a meeting. I thought I just might mention some of the things that preceded that, and then we're going to spend some time talking with our friend Lucas Miles. And that is a number of the Trump supporters, and not many, but enough of them, stormed barricades surrounding the Capitol. The police had to use pepper spray. Matter of fact, they actually urged the lawmakers to use tunnels as this debate has become so intense. So we'll talk more about that a little bit later, but it illustrates again some of the emotion being felt right now in the Capitol and some of the reasons for paying attention to those issues as well. But I thought just to divert our attention for a little bit from all that's happening today, you might want to know, as we oftentimes do, about films that might be encouraging to your Christian faith. And there is this new film out, which you can actually rent, called The Penitent Thief. It's a story, of course, of two individuals. You might remember on the cross, there's a thief on both sides of Jesus, and one is, if you will, dismissive of Jesus, and the other one is the so-called penitent thief. I think you would appreciate this as being a film that sort of asks, what would be the backstory to that? We've seen this already with the Chosen television program, and so we thought it would be good to let you know about that. We have information about how to rent it. We have information about watching the trailer if you'd like to do so. And most importantly, we wanted to talk with the individual that's behind a good portion of it, Lucas Miles, who is an individual that is actually oftentimes addressing all sorts of issues ranging from theology to politics to our culture. He is the host of Faithwire's The Lucas Miles Show, also the co-host of the Church Boys podcast, and also the author of the book, Good God, the One We Want to Believe in But Are Afraid to Embrace. So, Lucas, thank you so very much for joining us today here on Point of View.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's good to be on.
Tell us about the film for just a few minutes, and maybe we'll get into some of the other issues I know you'd like to address today on this very significant day. But we did want to give it its due, even though we scheduled it for the same day in which we're having the electoral vote count. And this really tells the story of these two unnamed men. We don't know their names, but you give them a story and a backstory. They were crucified along with Jesus, and one of them actually believes in Jesus, and then Jesus says, "Today you will be with me in paradise." But tell us more about the kind of the backstory of this film.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So the film is called The Penitent Thief, and it's based on a book called The Tale of the Penitent Thief, which was actually written by our executive producer, Don Willis. And so, he really set out to, he reading through the Gospels, and you see these characters mentioned at times that you don't have a lot of backstory on. And I think that's, you mentioned The Chosen earlier. I think that's one reason why The Chosen has been as successful as it is, because it's really bringing to life not only the stories that we're familiar with, but also these aspects of Scripture that, kind of gives us maybe a little bit more of a light of how this might have happened. And so Don wrote this book called The Tale of the Penitent Thief and approached me on it. I ended up, I got a copy of it from him and read it. And just right away, I thought, we got to make this a picture. And so we began working on this. We were really fortunate to get it out in 2020. So it released right before Christmas on streaming platforms, on-demand platforms, Amazon Prime, iTunes, places like that. And it stars Kevin Sorbo, who a lot of people would know, also Jay Giannone, some tremendous actors like Stelio Savante, James Rousseau. And it's really this sort of gritty tale of how these, in our account, we played the two thieves as brothers, which I think brings even more emotion to it. And, of how these two brothers, the life that they go through of starting off to be, very kind of grounded foundation and how they get thrust into this life of crime and sin and how that ultimately leads to the cross and the journey that the one goes through who becomes the penitent thief, and then certainly the other brother who rejects Christ. And so it's a really engaging tale. We actually filmed it in Weatherford, Texas, at the same place The Chosen did. We were there just a couple months before their first season filmed, and so just a great place there at Capernaum Village. And also we filmed at the Great Passion Play in Arkansas. And so just really excited to bring this to families, especially around this time.
Let's see if we can talk about some of the details. First of all, the first question that every parent or grandparent asks is, okay, we're talking about thieves. We're talking about, of course, there's sword play in it. Of course, there's a crucifixion. So we kind of give it a 13-plus rating, if you will. And yet it's not overly graphic, but it's enough to say, I'm not going to have my 4-year-old watch it. Fair?
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. I think there's some moments that, for a younger audience could be, a little bit more fear-producing, and there are multiple fatalities, throughout the film of this that kind of leads these two brothers to the life that they had. The crucifixion scene, while it's maybe not as graphic as say, Mel Gibson's Passion, it certainly brings some emotion with it, and so. I would recommend it, for an older audience, or at least parents maybe previewing it first, and deciding kind of where their kid's at, if it makes sense for their family.
And again, we have a link. You can go to Amazon and find it there easily enough, or a variety of other venues, but we've got that link there. There's a point where you can say, well, I want to watch the trailer, and the trailer is a little less than 2 minutes, so that gives you a little bit of an idea of what you're getting yourself into. But then there's a place where if people wanted to actually buy it, they could do so. If they wanted to rent it, very inexpensive. So, I mean, sometimes you have some people say, well, it wasn't, Hollywood quality. Yeah, well, you're also not going into a theater and paying 4 or 5 times as much either for something that still would give you kind of a backstory. And that's something that I think people would really appreciate, because it is in the Bible, but we know nothing other than the brief conversation between Jesus and the thief. And you kind of fill out what it would have been like in that culture, because almost any crime, especially if you were not a Roman citizen, could end up in a whipping or even in a crucifixion. And so you can kind of see how brutal the Roman Empire was, can't you?
Absolutely. And actually, Kevin Sorbo plays King Herod, who would have been a Jewish ruler, at that time, that we know, who was kind of operating within, although he was had a Hebrew background, was operating underneath this kind of greater authority of occupied by Rome. And Kevin just does a great job of kind of bringing that kind of bad guy element to this, which is we normally see him as the good guy and the hero, and obviously from his days of Hercules and all the faith-based films he's done, he's typically the hero in the story. And so this was a unique opportunity for him to kind of be able to play the bad guy, and he just does a great job, and I think brings just a lot of life and meaning, to the really, Herod's pursuit of slaying of the innocents, and we see, Jesus and Joseph and Mary, it really covers the Christmas story to the cross, and so it's a great film. I think if you want to watch it the holidays, whether that be Christmas or Easter, I think it plays either season quite well.
Yes. I might just mention the last time I had Sorbo in here that one of the things Kevin Sorbo was talking about is the fact he does usually play the good guy, and then all of a sudden he started playing the bad guy, or he was the atheist professor and a variety of others. And so in some respects, now we've had a chance over more recently, especially if people don't know his earlier work, some of our younger audience, they only know him as the bad guy, so he plays a pretty good bad guy there as well. Just before we take a break, any other thoughts you might have on the film? And then when we come back, we'll talk a little bit about what's going on, obviously, in our culture, because you've been writing about that as well.
Yeah,
but what do people need to know? Because what I think I might point out is you can actually click on another button that says more purchase options. And the reality is that if you even rent or buy one that isn't a high definition, you can even save more money. So it's a very inexpensive purchase. And lots of times right now during COVID-19 and the lockdowns and the pandemic, we get a little bit cabin bound, and you can't necessarily go to a theater, but you can bring the theater to you with some of these videos and some of the streaming that you're making available.
Absolutely. We expect a DVD run later here in the first quarter, but it is on streaming platforms, so I'm sure that most families have that accessible to them. And I think the other thing just to, that's worth mentioning with Christian filmmaking, independent filmmaking, is, this wasn't a studio picture. This was an independent group. That we've kind of banded together. We've done a couple films together with some of the major players on the production team of this in the past. And, we really want to continue bringing, good quality, wholesome family content, out there. And, we're really only able to do that by people supporting it. I think that oftentimes we kind of villainize Hollywood and, why don't they make better stuff? Well, I think that, if we want to see, more faith-based content, we have to support it when it comes out. And so we certainly appreciate everybody who's doing that and, helping this film just be a success.
Well, that's what we've tried to do from time to time, bring in some of these actors and actresses and talk about some of the positives out there. Again, not a high production value kind of film, but one that I think would be kind of interesting to you. So let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll talk with Lucas Miles, just some thoughts about what's going on in our culture. And if you have some comments or questions, we certainly welcome your phone calls. 1-800-351-1212. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join the conversation, let's open up the phones again, because we are now having individuals storming the Capitol. The House and Senate have decided to actually go into recess. These 4 levels of barriers that actually protected the Cannon House office building and others have been torn down. People heading in, giving out gas masks to some of the members of Congress. Of course, as I pointed out just a minute ago, they had urged them originally to use the tunnels to actually go to Capitol Hill. Now they're going to probably use some of those tunnels to go back to their offices. And we're going to have quite a contentious day, so we'll continue talking about that. Kent, if you got any comments about that, I'll get to Kent in just a minute. Let me go to Lucas. First of all, Lucas, any thoughts about this? Because we oftentimes write about the division in this country. Just the other day, we had David French on talking about the polarization and division in America, and we certainly see it on display right now on Capitol Hill, don't we?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I have a new book that just became available for pre-order yesterday. We announced it, called "The Christian Left: How Liberal Thought Has Hijacked the Church," talking about that very divide in our country on a faith level. And what we're seeing right now in D.C., I think it's to some degree it's almost too early to know exactly what's going on. I'm getting reports from friends that are who work in buildings down at the Capitol who are on the ground, and there's still confusion on. Is this Antifa in kind of MAGA gear? Are these MAGA supporters? I think there's still a lot of unknowns in the situation as it rolls out, and so I think it's important as we're looking at this that we really take time to kind of evaluate what's actually happening there. But we feel that divide. You see that divide on social media, you feel it in news reporting, you see it certainly at the ballot box, and this is a country that is the fabric is very I don't want to say it's torn, but it's tearing. And I think it's very important right now that the church, is able to kind of stand up and be a light, not just for left or right politics, but for truth, and really, that we really take time to kind of get our bearings, gather ourselves together, and more than anything, pray about the situation as we're seeing, these things go forward.
Again, The Christian Left, How Liberal Thought Has Hijacked the Church, and we'll get into that with you when the book comes out. And thank you for giving that advance announcement, and thank you for joining us today. But I think we're going to be covering now for a few minutes all the events that are unfolding there on Capitol Hill.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you for joining us today. Let me, while we're doing that, I mentioned Kent a minute ago. He had called in from South Carolina, wanted to ask a question or make a comment. So, Kent, you have the floor. Thank you for joining us today. Maybe I don't have Kent there. Oh, there you are. Go ahead.
Yes, sir. I left the Republican Party as well as the Democratic Party some time ago, and joined the American Solidarity Party for a number of reasons, not the least of which, with respect to the gentleman who just spoke about the church, I completely agree, but not so much about the church standing up for truth, but the church standing up for Christ. That's what the church is about. It's about Jesus. It's not about politics. It's not about whether or not somebody thinks that some kind of fraud happened or not in a secular election. It's about the message of Jesus Christ. And I think the problem that we're seeing right now, number one, as a former Marine, too, I find it just audacious, whether you want to blame it on Antifa or MAGA, that they'd had the audacity to storm the U.S. Capitol and put a threat on lives and on our democracy in the United States of America. That's not what we went to fight for. These people should be ashamed of themselves. And the number one person who should be ashamed of himself is Donald Trump himself. We can talk all we want about nuances and parsing of this. We can talk about how we want to identify what fraud is out there in correcting elections. But if you watch the president today, he didn't discuss about insignificant cases compared to the actual percentage of over 150 million people who voted in this election. He's talking about that there was fraud that would have overturned the election. Let's not call this anything else but a man who is trying to subvert the United States of America, and he happens to be the president of the United States. And if the church wants to do something right on truth, distance ourselves. The Apostle Paul said, don't even associate with a person of his kind. It's time for us to get real and to stop trying to make excuses, because we're not going anywhere until the church does that kind of truth. I appreciate the time, though.
I can't appreciate that. I might just mention that Justin Giboney is going to be with us. We're going to be talking about compassion and conviction. And one of the questions I was going to say is, in light of all the polarization, which has now been manifested itself in very dramatic ways, what in the world are we going to have in the future? I suspect there are going to be a lot of people that will be turned off to voting, a fair number of people that will simply say, why get involved? Because if you are convinced that there was fraud, you're not going to vote. If you're convinced that everybody that is talking about fraud is overplaying themselves and making cases that don't exist, that is the case. But in case you've just joined us, you know, this crowd, whoever it was, and again, again, it tends to be, we would assume, the pro-Trump crowd, but there could be some other individuals associated with that. These have moved on to the Capitol, and this is while there was a joint session of Congress, which, of course, now, you talk about finger pointing, this is going to be happening in very significant ways. And so the Capitol Police have moved to evacuate the Cannon office building after the crowd overwhelmed some of the barriers there. There have been the use of tear gas, flashbangs, and others on the crowd. There have been reports of a number of suspicious packages near the Capitol grounds. And then you've had the situation in which you had to escort the Vice President Mike Pence out of the chamber and actually ask for the various members of Congress to leave the building. And, of course, some of them going into an office complex where they may be confronted there as well. Now, to be fair, Donald Trump Jr. condemned the action, saying, stop acting like the other side, but that has not diminished what is taking place there. And if nothing else, just an illustration of what is unfolding right now on Capitol Hill. We suspected that it would be very confrontational inside the chambers. We wondered what would happen outside the chambers, and of course, that's exactly what's unfolding right now. So we come back from the break. Would love to get your comments. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. We, of course, had Kent answering some of the questions, making some comments. I see some rest of you want to address the issue. And the original plan was to talk about this book, Compassion and Conviction, and maybe we can get some comments from Justin Giboney about that, because after all, he certainly is calling for Christians to be involved politically, but also to use biblical principles as they get involved. And yet, at the same time, I want to raise some very good questions that we raised yesterday with David French about the polarization that is taking place and whether or not even some of the incidents that have actually unfolded right now in this last hour, whether that is going to cause even more people to simply say, I've given up on politics. And back to the very important question, what is the role of Christians? What is the role of the church? And so we want to give you that opportunity to join the conversation. So if nothing else, we recognize that we've posted a couple of very good articles on the website that I think you're going to find helpful. One on hard truths about this whole issue of the certification of the Electoral College vote. One on the attempts to ridicule the issue of election fraud, and then one more on the blessings and curses of federalism, which maybe I'll try to get to, but I might not be able to given all the events that are transpiring right now. So let's take a break, and if you would like to join the conversation, that number is 1-800-351-1212. Had a Georgia elections last night, and we have the certification of the Electoral College vote. And we have a lot more to cover, and we will do our best to try to cover all of that right after these important messages.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Well, this has been a very interesting day, as we suspected it might, but we did not expect necessarily all of this. We're going to be talking about this new book, Compassion and Conviction, in just a minute, as I mentioned, but let me just give you an update on what's happening on Capitol Hill right now, and that is a number of these individuals that were part of the rally. They may all have been Trump supporters. There may have been Antifa part of it. We do not know. We do know this. Those individuals stormed the barricades. They removed 4 levels of barricades to the Capitol. The Capitol Police had to use pepper spray to actually keep them from entering into the building. Some were able to do so. Some climbed on TV towers, which are near where the inauguration stage will be taking place. This also took place in a situation where there were some various suspected packages. One, a pipe bomb that was located in one of the offices that caused an evacuation. They've been using underground tunnels first to go into the joint session of Congress because of fear. Now they've been using the underground tunnels to evacuate. And you have, so far, I think I have the number of 10 people that have been arrested. Some have been detained for possession of firearms, while others have been arrested for assaulting police officers. So those are all part of what has been unfolding right now in the Capitol. We will, of course, this hour cover much more of it, but our original plan, I think, is even more appropriate. Yesterday, when we spent some time talking with David French about his book, Divided We Fall, we point out how polarized America is. If you needed any more evidence, just simply look at some of the images coming out of Capitol Hill right now. You have a pretty good idea. And so where do we go in terms of Christians really trying to engage the culture in a biblical way? That's why we wanted to feature this book, Compassion and Conviction. And it talks about the AND campaign. And it is written by Justin Giboney, as well as Michael Ware and Chris Butler. They are individuals that have put all of this together. Justin is a co-founder of what's called the AND campaign, also an attorney and political strategist, and joins us now by phone. So, Justin, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thanks for having me, Kerby. Glad to be here.
What are your thoughts about some of the things that are transpiring right now on Capitol Hill? We just had one individual a while back said this is all the more reason to maybe not get involved in politics and have the church be the church and stop dealing with all this stuff and stop even defending some of these individuals that are part of this political process. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think it's more reason for us to get involved. I don't think it's the Christian's job to stay out of something because it may be a little bit dirty. If we're going to be the salt and the light, we have to have contact with what we're supposed to be enriching. And I think politics presents us with a huge opportunity, a robust opportunity to promote human flourishing and defend human dignity. And so if we stray away from that, I think we'd be bad stewards. We just need to set a different example, and I'm just not sure we're doing that right now.
Oh, I know that. You know, one of the things I appreciate about your book is that in the past, and I've been doing this a long time, I'm much older than you, I would sometimes talk about the need for Christians to get involved. And the answer was always, well, I don't see the Apostle Paul get involved politically in anything like that. And you have a whole section where you remind us that whether we look at Joseph or Moses or Daniel or Ezra, Nehemiah, or even, for example, the Apostle Paul, not to mention the examples you give from history, William Wilberforce, Frederick Douglass, Catherine Booth, and a variety variety of others, that we really have a long tradition, both in the Old and New Testament, but even through Western culture, of Christians getting involved in political issues and engaging the culture. I mean, again, that's how we become salt and light, right?
Yeah, that's exactly it. And even with that example with Paul did actually use his citizenship on multiple occasions. And so he exercised that, but especially in the Old Testament, you see over and over again, whether it's the prophets or others, getting involved with government, either to be helpful or just to straighten things out. Government is an ordained institution, and we need to make sure that it's serving its purpose, which is about order and justice, because too many lives are on the line. And so we know that it'll never be perfect, but it is our job to do what we can to make sure that people are flourishing and that the love and truth of Christ is always present through our actions.
I might just mention this book came out in the fall, actually, I guess in the summer, and it's a book that I think you could get University Press. We have information about it so that you can get it in paperback or Kindle. But how we engage really brings me to one of your chapters. Years ago, when I wrote a book on Christian ethics in plain language, I had a whole section on truth and justice, but I added a section on civility. And one of your chapters is on civility. I think it is more necessary than ever, because what we find is that there is such a tendency in this culture that is so divided and so, in a sense, polarized, that we as Christians probably are going to have to be, in the midst of this hostile culture, be the best examples of Christian citizens and provide the best example of civility. And in that respect, maybe we'll stand out from a culture which is so busy labeling people, finger pointing, and really being very mean-spirited in any kind of political discourse.
Yeah, that's right. There's a misconception, Kerby, that civility is only for times that aren't so tough, that aren't so polarized. But I would go against that. I think civility are for the times that are tough. I mean, anybody can be civil when there's no tension. But I think it's in the midst of tension is really when civility matters the most. And so Christians have to find ways. Another way to put it is to be peacemakers, is to find that shalom, bring about healing. And it's important to know that peacemaking isn't just about being passive, right? It's not passivism, but it's trying to bring about restoration. And so it is about that moral order and justice that the AND campaign talks so much about.
Well, and again, like you said, I think we should be peacemakers in a time when there's very little peace, when there's a cancel culture and there's finger pointing and there's the polarization we talked about with David French when he was on with us yesterday. I mean, just to make the point, and then we'll take a break and come back and get into some other aspects. He talks about these so-called landslide counties. And back in 1980, when I first started doing some radio and was on with Marlon Maddox on this program, Point of View, there are about 400 of those counties. Now, we call it a landslide county because that's a place where one presidential candidate wins by at least 20 points. So it's really dark blue or it's really dark red. Well, now we got about 1,700 of those counties, more than 3 times as many, and it illustrates, again, the polarization that takes place. And so the reason for us to actually be willing to hear other individuals who we might disagree with. And so when we come back from the break, one of the chapters that I found most helpful in your book was this idea of partnerships, because people wonder, well, how can I partner with them? And then you got to love a guy that actually has read Francis Schaeffer, because Francis Schaeffer talked about co-belligerence and this idea of partisanship, because that gets us into some important issues as well. Because as I've said on this program many times before, when people say, I really want to change the society, I really want to right injustice, and so they oftentimes say, what should I do? And I say, well, it's a pronoun problem. What should we do? Join together with other like-minded individuals to make a difference, because you will then be able to make a difference. So we come back, we're going to spend some time talking for just a few more minutes with Justin, and then we're going to take some phone calls. So if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Today, both houses of Congress will meet to formally count the votes of the Electoral College. In previous years, this has been a mere formality. But 2020 and 2021 are not typical years. Presiding over this joint session is the Vice President, who will have to rule on challenges from Republican members of Congress. The debate about the slate of electors from each state is likely to rekindle the debate about the Electoral College. In previous commentaries, I've talked about the many criticisms leveled against this constitutional institution. Some have argued that it is racist and actually provides an advantage to white people. But that is not how many black leaders perceive it. They believe the Electoral College gives African Americans a significant vote. Civil rights leader Vernon Jordan, for example, argued that if you take away the Electoral College, then the importance of that black vote melts away. Blacks, instead of being crucial to victory in major states, simply become 10% of the total electorate with reduced impact. Not only does the Electoral College protect the vote of minorities, it also protects the vote of smaller states. That is why the framers created it in the first place. They were fearful that big states and big cities would always determine the outcome. Tara Ross, in her book, The Indispensable Electoral College, How the Founders' Plan Saves Our Country from Mob Rule, provides many examples from history. The founders provided a system that today provides representation for groups as diverse as farmers, minorities, and small states. Many states have signed on to the National Popular Vote Compact that would eventually dismantle the Electoral College, but the initiative seems stalled for now. I doubt today's debate will encourage any other states to sign on to the compact. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Justin Giboney with us as we talk about a book that he's co-authored with a number of other individuals, many of whom we've had a chance to interact with before, Michael Ware and Chris Butley and others. And one of the things you talk about is that the gospel has political implications and Christians must transcend tribalism. And it's interesting how your book really parallels very much of what we talked about yesterday with David French, because you talk about the hidden tribes of America study. And that is something I've written commentaries about. And it breaks people into tribes, progressive activists and liberals and passive, all the way to traditional conservatives and devoted conservatives. What you find is that almost all of the dialogue takes place from the two extremes, but there's a middle group, which I think oftentimes is the group I'm speaking to on radio, which is called the exhausted majority, 67%. And I think underscore the word exhausted majority. I think in light of even some of the events that have transpired over the last couple of weeks and months, that exhausted majority might be larger because they're just so exhausted. They say, Justin, I don't even want to get involved in the political process. What would you say to them?
I would want to challenge the exhausted majority. Sometimes they can kind of be cast as victims, and I actually think that I fit into that exhausted majority to some extent too. But they have a responsibility, or we have a responsibility. We have a civic responsibility, and we cannot allow a minority on either side to control our politics. And the only reason they do that, number one, they are more affluent, but they don't have the numbers. They're just more involved. And until the exhausted majority decides to get more involved and to really take control and take ownership of what's going on in our civic space, we're going to continue to have these problems. And especially when it comes to Christians, it's so important for us not to get drawn in to these ideological tribes. Whether you consider yourself a progressive or a conservative, you are a Christian first. And too often we have conflated our ideology with our theology. Too often we've allowed our political affiliation to become religious in nature, wherein we're doing things that we consider to be part of our theology or our faith, and they're really just ideological, and that happens on both sides of the aisle.
Certainly does. And one of the things I appreciate that I think even in the introduction of the book, if I remember right, if you are going to be offended because I criticize either left or right, you're going to have a problem with the book because you really take on both sides. And that's sort of what we talk about. But it gets me to the other part of that chapter, and that is partnerships, because there is, if you will, as you say, when it comes to politics, there's power in numbers. And oftentimes when people say, well, what can I do? I say, well, pronoun problem. What can we do? You know, align yourself with other people with whom you agree, whether it is the pro-life issue, whether it's the issue of pornography, whether it's justice issues, race issues, environmental issues, you name it. But it then brings us to something which I so appreciate you putting in this book, and that is the idea of co-belligerence, because lots of times people will say, look, I'm a Christian, and do I agree with everybody that's a part of this movement? I may be a Protestant, but I'm in the pro-life movement with Catholics. I'm in the pro-life movement with Muslims sometimes, Mormons, all sorts of people. And there's a sense in which we don't have to have complete theological agreement to try to push forward an issue that we feel is an important issue. So speak to that issue, because I'm so grateful that you actually put that in the book.
Yeah, I mean, we have to understand, because you hear both sides. So you have some people who don't want to really interact with believers whose theology is a little different, or even non-believers, right? The idea behind co-belligerency is common grace. That's kind of the foundation of this, which is even non-believers can do good work, right? And so we see that in abolition. We see that in the civil rights movement, Christians coming together with others to do good work. Now, what we have to understand within these partnerships when we're talking about co-belligerence is that if it's not coming from a Christian foundation, then at some point there's going to be a divergence. And too often what happens, whether it be in our partnerships or our partisanship, we don't understand where the divergence is supposed to be. So let's say that I'm interested in social justice. Well, if I join a group that is fighting against police brutality, that's great, but do I know where my beliefs diverge from theirs? And if I haven't set that out from the beginning, if I don't have an understanding, then I get drawn into something that may not be biblical. And that happens on a number of different issues.
Of course.
But we have to make sure, the main point is that we can partner with non-believers. These are conditional partnerships and somewhat limited, but we can do good things. We do have to understand what the limits of that partnership is, and that takes some time and some thought to do.
What about this idea of church and state? That's one of your chapters as well. And there are a lot of people that simply say, look, the church has to deal with ecclesiastical matters. The state has to deal with civil matters. The two should be kept separate. I obviously know that you would disagree, and I would think that most of our listeners would disagree, but the fact that you made that one of the longer chapters in the book illustrates the fact that you, and no doubt others, have bumped up against this whole issue of whether it's even appropriate for Christians to be involved. And then as we recognize that the institutions need to be separate, but that doesn't mean that we as people with beliefs, Christian beliefs, should be excluded from the public arena, yet we do have a secular culture that's really trying to make that possible.
Yeah, I would start by saying, Kerby, that it is impossible to truly separate your faith from your politics. If the Christian faith is a lifestyle, if it's a set of beliefs that apply to everything that we do, then it is impossible to separate it from our politics. And it's the same thing for, say, a secular progressive, right? A secular progressive isn't asked to separate their ideology or their values from their politics. No one should be. And in fact, when we talk about the separation between church and state, that's not what it even means, right? We're talking more so about there should be no establishment of any religion or any church, as in, the Church of England or something like that. That's what that was referring to. It was not saying that people shouldn't use their values and apply to the issues. The fact of the matter is that you cannot create a law. As an attorney who's drafted legislation, I can tell you there is no legislation that in some way doesn't involve someone's values.
That's right.
Whether those values come from a secular point of view or a Christian point of view, those are to be used, and I think the founders wanted those to be used.
And again, I've even made the joke that even something as simple as a stop sign shows values. First of all, it shows the value that you believe that government can set rules and tell you to stop, and that government is certainly an instrument of God, and it's an institution of God, and so it has the authority to do so. It also shows the value that having controlled intersections values life, and so if you can find values in a stop sign, you can find it in almost anything else. But just before we run out of time, because I've got a whole bank of phone callers that want to talk about what's going on Capitol Hill right now, I did want to also point our listeners to the andcampaign.org. You can go to our website, pointofview.net, or simply go to that. It's the andcampaign.org, andcampaign.org. And so talk about that, because you have a mission to really educate and organize Christians for civic and cultural involvement. So when people go onto that website, what are you doing to equip them in terms of cultural engagement?
Yeah, so we really try to provide a lot of tools and really content to raise civic literacy among Christians. We want Christians to be able to enter into the public space in an informed manner so that they can be more effective, but also know how to apply their values to the issues of the day. And that isn't done in the best way through partisanship or ideological tribes. It's done by understanding the biblical framework, which is what Compassion and Conviction talks about. And really, we work on the idea that within our political space right now, there is a false dichotomy between justice and moral order. Whereas some people choose justice and others choose moral order, we think that the gospel forces us to choose both. And so the AND campaign is a combination of orthodoxy and orthopraxy, of justice and moral order, rather than choosing one or the other.
And I might just mention that you have a podcast that people can follow. There's a Prayer and Action Justice Initiative and a number of other things. And, of course, if you want to get a copy of the book, that is available there at your website. So as people go there, they can get a copy, and they can also find some of the other resources. So kind of a difficult day in which we put you on, but in some respects maybe most appropriate. So thank you for writing the book. Thank your co-authors for writing it as well. And thank you for giving me some time today here on Point of View.
Thanks for having me, Kirby. Take care.
We are going to take a break, and I see a lot of phone calls. So some of you want to address all sorts of issues, some which have been said on the air, others about what's going on in terms of Capitol Hill. Been an unusual day. We knew there would be conflict. We thought it would be inside the chambers of Congress, not outside, but nevertheless, if it does not illustrate for you the fact that we are such a divided and polarized nation, I don't know what else can illustrate it. And so we'll come back, and I'm going to give you about a half an hour just to really express your opinion. We have a national platform, and we wanted to give that to you. So those of you that would like to join the conversation, we'll get to as many phone calls as we can. The program's called Point of View. We want to hear your point of view.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour. Love to hear your comments. 1-800-351-1212, an open line. Shots were heard fired in the Capitol. There was one shooting victim that's been taken to the hospital. Of course, we will know a lot more as it unfolds. Always difficult to do a live program and still try to keep track of what's happening, but the chaos and pandemonium make it difficult to give even accurate reports, and I've learned sometimes less is better because sometimes some of those initial reports are incorrect. So if nothing else, I have seen some pictures of people with their guns drawn. These look like members of Congress, not just some of the people doing any kind of security details. So we will get to that. But let's take some phone calls. Some of you have been waiting a while, and I did want to give you a chance to address some of these comments that we've been making. So we'll head first to Nevada, KNLB. Bonnie, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Hi, Kerby. Thank you for everything, for opening my eyes, first of all. And Happy New Year. I'm responding to the gentleman that called earlier, and he seems to resemble many people that I ran into, I guess, before the election in my own friends. And so part of me was like, well, maybe he's not a regular listener. Maybe he's not a Christian. Maybe he's just like my friends. Maybe he is a Christian and he's holding Donald Trump to a higher standard than the rest of us. I know that my past is definitely not clean. And, for anybody to sit there and persecute Donald Trump because of whatever he's done in his past, or because he's gruff, or because he calls people names or whatever. I mean, walk a mile in somebody's shoes before you condemn them. What happened to mercy? What happened to grace? And why is it that we're persecuting him as if he were Jesus and had one sin? And on the flip side of that, why is it that we're ignoring Joe Biden's actual crimes? The crimes of his actual family, that physical, and yet persecuting Donald Trump for his personality. America is so lost, Kerby. Maybe he's just not a regular listener. I don't know. Maybe we need to.
Well, and again, I think a fair-minded person would say, look, and the other day I thought John Zermick was actually even saying, well, we will repent of actually saying that Donald Trump was God or he was Jesus Christ. He was, of course, being very facetious about that because that's kind of the allegation being made. But let's face it, there are some rough edges, to put it mildly, to Donald Trump. And if you're looking for examples of civility, like we were talking about just a minute ago with Justin, okay, I would tend to go to Mike Pence long before I would go to Donald Trump. But again, sometimes the never-Trumpers can never acknowledge the positive things that have come from his administration. And sometimes the always-Trumpers can never acknowledge some of the gruffness and the difficulty and the bullishness and even the braggadocio we were talking about just a few minutes ago of Donald Trump. I think both are equally true. And I live in a world where people are flawed, and I wish people didn't have all these idiosyncrasies and these character flaws. But the reality is they do. And in an ideal world, I'd love a person who is in the Oval Office that has great character, is good on the issues, has the right kind of people in their administration. And I've yet to find that actually happening. Sometimes if you get 2 out of 3, you're doing pretty good because it's just the nature of the fallenness of our world. And so that's fine. That's what we have to live with. But I appreciate you listening, and I appreciate you calling in, and if nothing else, wanting to try to set the record straight. So, Bonnie, thank you so very much for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you, and thank you for everything you do on Point of View.
We are going to take a few more phone calls, but that does open up a line in case if somebody would like to add comments. You may agree or disagree, but I want to maybe move from Nevada to Arizona, but still on KNLB, and talk to Michael. Michael, thank you for joining us today.
Yes, the reason I'm calling is, according to the Standard newspaper here in Mojave County, our president got 74,444 votes. This is out of 100,000. in our county alone, and little over 24,000 for Joe Biden. Now, we're just one little county in Arizona. But what I don't understand is how we could possibly have won the election.
And again, let me use Arizona example because, as you know, Arizona is primarily kind of a red-like state, but then you have some hot spots of blue, if you want to use the red-blue analogy, which many people do. And so the argument which was being made, and again, it's worth evaluating and reevaluating, is that even though there was a massive amount of red all through the state of Arizona, those few little almost dots of blue overwhelmed the red. And of course, that's why there have been people looking at some of the issues and the allegations there in the state of Arizona. They've looked at them in a couple of other states, and I do believe that there are some questions that could honestly be raised. For example, the Arizona Republican Party I've got on front of here says alleged more than 100,000 ballots were improperly cast in Arizona, and that they argue that there were 28,000 duplicated ballots in Maricopa County. Now, is that true? Well, I think that's an allegation, but the issue is that you have to find some way in a court of law to look at that and to then hear, are there answers to that? Because some of the allegations turned out to not be true. But let me use Arizona as a good example because the best estimates I have in front of me here are 10,457 votes separate Joe Biden and Donald Trump. Well, if you go back to those 28,000 duplicated ballots, okay. And that's what people like Kelly Ward and others in Arizona have been bringing to the fore. And it seems to me that if we don't have any resolution, which I doubt we will, in this certification of the Electoral College vote, then it brings me back to something that we had a statement earlier by Jim Jordan, and that is, can we at least have something that looks like an investigation, either in the House of Representatives, in the United States Senate, or even with the Attorney General, so that we can, if nothing else, give people confidence that maybe this was not a perfect election, but there were not enough electoral irregularities to actually justify the protests we're seeing right now on Capitol Hill. So, again, I think you raise a very good question when you look at the state of Arizona. And I can do that, of course, for Arizona. We can do that for Nevada, because we just talked with Bonnie just a minute ago. There are arguments in the testimony before the Senate Homeland Security Committee that there were 42,000 people who voted multiple times. Is that true? There was the allegation that at least 1,500 people who voted actually were dead voters. Do we have zombie voters there? And so you can begin to recognize that's more of an uphill slog because, after all, Joe Biden won Nevada supposedly over Donald Trump by 33,000 votes. So that one would require a lot more digging. Wisconsin, again, we just mentioned earlier, 20,000 vote differences and some of the rest. And so those are legitimate questions. And as my second article that I've posted today argues only so persuasively, it is a very good piece that came out of the Federalist by Stella Morabito. She says, ignoring and ridiculing election fraud concerns will not make them go away. I think the hope on the part of some of the leaders in the Democratic Party and the House of Representatives, the hope on part of the media, both in big media and big tech, is that eventually if we just make fun of anybody that questions the election, or if we just simply ignore that there are any concerns being raised, that eventually people will just settle down and that will be the end of it. I don't see a lot of evidence right now of that taking place on Capitol Hill or in the minds of a lot of individuals, because as I pointed out earlier, and I think Michael raised it only so well, 47% of voters, according to the Rasmussen poll, are not sure that the election was on an up or up. And you might say, well, okay, but, you know, Rasmussen, he's kind of a conservative. He's been on Point of View with you before. Okay. How about the Quinnipiac poll? And the Reuters poll, those are definitely left of center pollsters, and they still conclude that basically about 34%, according to Quimpiac, and similar numbers in the Reuters poll also disagree with the election results and wonder if there was fraud. And in the Rasmussen poll, it was like 75% of Republicans. Well, both in the Reuters and Quimpiac poll, it was about 50%. So you've just got too many people asking too many questions and having too much uncertainty. And if I'm Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, wouldn't you want to solve that and try to get people behind you to move forward? Maybe not. Anyway, let's take some more phone calls. 1-800-351-1212. We'll be back right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let me just mention tomorrow that we were going to be talking about everything from generosity to a variety of other issues. If this really unfolds, we might have to postpone some of that. We ought to, I guess we naively thought that maybe after the particular debate about the Electoral College and eventually the resolution that we'd be back to business as usual tomorrow. Well, that was naive, but we'll see where that takes us. And we'll certainly be talking about this all week. So I hope you'll join us tomorrow and certainly Friday weekend edition. But let me, if I can, go to California in this case. Bruce is asking a good question. I think I might be able to provide a little bit of perspective on that. So, Bruce, thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me. I just was wondering, I had two questions. One, if that were to ever happen and they invalidated all of the and they invalidated the whole election process. What does that say for those who were also won those seats in Congress? Does that invalidate their wins also? What would happen with them? And also, if the electoral college is not to be granted for what the people wanted to vote, then what does that do for the Senate and the Congress? Are they going to be voting for us, deciding on what side of the aisle they are?
Yeah, well, again, you've got some great questions. First of all, let me just point out that when there were some real challenges that took place for the presidency, we started asking some questions about, well, if that works at the top of the ballot, let's say they invalidated certain ballots, then would that also have affected some other races? And so those of you in Michigan, I'm going to talk to you for just a minute, because as we have looked at there were questions that were raised about some of these absentee ballots. There were some that found that there were a number of invalid addresses. There were some dead voters that voted, as you always, unfortunately, always have. Well, if you were to figure out a way to throw out those ballots, but of course, once they vote, you can't, you could see how that would have affected, for example, as Bruce points out, one of the other elections, and that would be the Senate election. Because in the state of Michigan, I should say, Gary Peters won with 49.9% of the vote. And John James lost by 48.2% of the vote, because you had Natural Law Party, Green Party, U.S. Taxpayers Party, and those kinds of things. By the way, I might just point out, here's a good example. If the U.S. Taxpayers Party, which is a conservative party, said, instead of voting for Valerie Willis, we vote for John James, he'd be sitting in the Senate. So you got to think that through for just a minute. But again, if you work your way down, if there's a problem at the top, there might be a problem further down. And so Bruce is asking a very good question, because how far would you go down to invalidate? Now, of course, we are not invalidating those, but it brings me back to the speech that was actually given yesterday by Jim Jordan, in which he was simply pointing out that, look, Donald Trump won 19 of the so-called bellwether counties. He won Ohio by 8, Iowa by 8, Florida by 3. He got 11 million more votes than he did before. And if you look at the House races, Republicans won 27 of the 27 toss-up races. And so in some respects, it was a really good election for the Republicans, but it wasn't a good election for Donald Trump. And so that's why he said, I want to have an investigation. And so he was one of those individuals that would have stood there today to challenge the Electoral College results. And I use him as one example of a Republican from Ohio. And then I use, if nothing else, a counter example of a Republican from Wisconsin, Mike Gallagher, who represents the 8th District, who makes the case, and I think it's an interesting case, and probably a constitutional one as well, that the Constitution has always said that the voting that takes place within the state is the responsibility of the state. And you can find that in Article 2 of the Constitution, certainly Article 2, Section 1, and some of those. And so as a result, there are some that are arguing, well, yes, but we also have this other particular piece of legislation that might be able to justify that, the so-called Electoral Count Act. And yet he would say that that belongs in the state. And so in some respects, it explains why you have, in this case, 2 Republicans, one in Ohio and one in Wisconsin, both Republicans, both believing theoretically in the Constitution, coming to different answers to that question. It also would explain why you have Tom Cotton, who's a senator, and Josh Hawley, who's a senator, both Republicans, and they come to different conclusions about how this would be implemented. And so, if nothing else, I'm hoping that there would be just a little bit of grace, maybe a little bit of charity in the midst of all of this, because indeed there are people who I think for honest reasons come to a disagreement, And we're not helped by when we refer to individuals that challenge the vote to accuse them, did you see that the other day, of sedition? I mean, seriously. And we're not helped, as my second article points out, of trying to ignore some very significant issues or to ridicule people as well. And so since I mentioned Tom Cotton, he's in the picture of the third article that I've made available, which we might encourage you to read as well, because it talks about the blessing and the curses of federalism. It comes from William Galston, who we've quoted on this program before, because he points out that, yes, the federal government has some role in terms of the election. You see that in Article 1, Section 4, Article 2, Section 1, in particular to address issues of discrimination, to provide for the equal right of every citizen to vote, regardless race, color, whatever, origin, all the rest. But then the argument being made that the Electoral Count Act in 1877 provides a mechanism to challenge the electors, but of course no contrary electors have been submitted. So we have agreed with this idea of federalism by saying that the states are responsible for actually the election. And you learned about this in civics class. You learned that there were certain enumerated powers given to the federal government, and the rest of the powers were reserved to the states and the people. And so anyway, William Galston talks about how in some respects that provides, if you will, some kind of resolution in terms of the national election, because it's really not a national election. It's 50 state elections plus the District of Columbia that has national implications. But then he goes on from there to point out the fact that the downside of this has been that we also have the states responsible for distributing the vaccines for COVID-19. And it turns out that most of these states were supposed to submit preliminary vaccine distribution and administration plans. But since we have, in the past, because of the recession in 2008 and 2009, many states have cut back on funding for public health. They were just completely overwhelmed and financially unprepared for tests and contract tracing, and now even the distribution of these vaccines in a timely manner. And so here we're now also having people complain about the inability to get some of those vaccines. And so this third article just reminds us that we live in a federal system. I suspect the incoming president is going to want to change that as much as he or she can. But nevertheless, we are dealing with some very significant challenges here in the 21st century. We'll see what unfolds over the next couple of hours, whether Congress reconvenes. We'll figure that out, what conversations take place. And, of course, we'll be here tomorrow at Point of View. So, first of all, I want to thank Andrew and Doug for their help behind the scenes engineering this program today. I want to thank Steve for working on all the problems with our phones and answering the phone calls. And I hope that you will join us tomorrow right here on Point of View.
Sometimes I think about seeds. You ever stop to consider that some seeds become entire trees and some trees grow up and produce fruit? Other seeds become flowers or vines that bring us vegetables or berries. And some trees don't have fruit, but they're just pretty, especially in some parts of the country when it comes to the fall colors. Yes, sometimes my mind goes off like that. And I also think about such things when it comes to the seeds that so many have planted in the quest to impact our nation through Point of View Radio. You may think that your gift is a small thing, but like a seed, it can grow to have an impact beyond your imagination. If you want to see beauty again in America, consider planting a seed today and making a difference by joining the Point of View Truth Team. Get the details today, right now, by visiting pointofview.net/team or call us at 1-800-347-5151. Plant a seed for a great future. Cultivate truth. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.